समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for strategic and international affairs, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. Now, Swasti, today we begin with a burning issue in our neighborhood, Pakistan, which is the Balochistan insurgency.
Of course.
There has been a spate of attacks across the weekend, and I begin with a question from Narendra Arya, who says that Balochistan insurgency is now on its peak, and as usual, they are blaming India. But do you think China is somehow involved in it?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to ask a separate question that how can India and China manage the Balochistan issue? What is your opinion on it?
So I'll just try to put it into perspective, Devta. So this perception that Baloch insurgency in Pakistan is currently at its peak, I think it's more or less an Indian construct, because what happens is that if on the Pakistani side, there are cycles. Okay, I mean it comes in cycles, right? So it's like every few years you would see that the Baloch, and they are a formidable force. I mean they are heavily armed. Remember these were the guys that actually killed the 4 Chinese nationals.
Yes.
In Gwadar, they have made the Chinese lives miserable. So it's all the Baloch, people that are doing it. So quickly, first part. Has it reached its peak? I mean, somewhere the assumption that it's already reached a pinnacle and from here on it can only go to a decisive side is not actually entirely true, because one, it keeps coming in cycles. And if you look at and see, Pakistan always says, even after absorbing all the damage that the Balochi Liberation Army actually perpetrates on them, that they have it now under control, etc., etc. But then there are also certain other issues which we need to understand better, because from the Indian perspective, and quite naturally, we are mostly focused on the Baloch problem within Pakistan. And because Baloch people are so marginalized and, I mean, they are persecuted, etc. So obviously India has this moral support also to, Balochistan. We have taken this issue several times in the GPS. But that's where it sort of falls short, because Baloch people are not just in Pakistan. Baloch, in fact, are a transnational group which are part in Pakistan, then in the Sistan province in Iran, and then a part in southern Afghanistan. So that is the greater Baloch area. Now, while India wants Pakistan to be destabilized to liberate Balochistan, would India have the same approach to destabilizing Afghanistan for the greater Balochistan, to actualize, or would India go to the extent of destabilizing Iran for this? So I think in this greater Balochistan, approach, there are certain, especially from the Indian side, there are certain limitations. So our analysis mostly is focused on the Pakistan bit. Our analysis is not really focused on, the Sistan, Balochistan province in Iran, or on the Afghanistan side. And also there are very useful studies actually done by a lot of scholars who are experts on the Middle Eastern region and in this particular region, where they have compared the Baloch issue with the Kurds. Because just like Kurds are not one nation, but are a very strong, very resilient, very, a kind of a fighter race, divided in certain parts of Turkey, certain parts of Syria, certain parts of Iraq. And just now, there was so much news on this particular equation evolving between the Syrian National Army, etc. So I don't want to take it there. But what I want to tell you is that please keep this comparison in mind. Sometimes it is very useful that just like Kurds are a very, ferocious breed of people who are very nationalistic, but yet divided into, these parts. And because of these different countries, they are not able to sort of unite. They are able to project a certain power in one part of the country or in one part of one country, but it cannot be replicated in other countries. Okay, so that's one. Similarly, if you look at the Baloch issue, you find a lot of similarities. The second is that while the Baloch on the Pakistani side are a separatist movement, are a nationalist movement, but if you look at the Baloch on the Iranian side, they are largely a Sunni radical group, okay? And so that there is a difference also. Similarly, you also have to take into account a factor that nobody talks about. While there is a larger, Baloch population there, and you don't really see that the political, equations are the same. But having said that, there is a porous border and there is a shadow economy existing in the Baloch people on the Iranian side, on the Afghan side, and they are smuggling right from opium to banned Iranian oil, and also the banned Russian oil, also Russian weapons. So you see that there is a thriving economy there. And in fact, if you carefully see, there are some very wonderful researches that have happened that have said that in many ways, on the Iran side, now while the Baloch are the most persecuted people in Iran, okay, they are the one of the most persecuted minorities in Iran, and they get by far the highest number of death penalties also. But despite that, the fact that they run a shadow economy, also becomes useful to sort of keep them contained, right? So this is, I think, if you don't bring in the shadow economy part of how it becomes a hub, these porous borders become hubs of a lot of transnational smuggling and money networks and laundering networks. You don't really get the full picture, right? So when we are talking about it sitting in New Delhi, we tend to imagine that these are watertight compartments, but the reality on the ground is very, very different. In fact, you can see on the screen also, I have referred to this one article by Dr. Ilya Rubanis that I work with very closely, which was actually published in the print, where he said that why is it that India doesn't have a Baloch strategy? So he says that while India's Baloch strategy in Pakistan is only, adhering to that political question of separatism and all the support that is required, for it, etc., the international support that is required for it, but we still don't have a strategy for engaging the Baloch on the Iranian side. Okay, and if you read it, you will get a few sort of insights, but his larger argument is the same, which is that you really have to develop a kind of a engagement process with the economic side of it, right? I mean, there is a shadow economy. So things look very different than they really are when you sort of zoom in and zoom out your strategic gaze. As far as the question of China is concerned, obviously the Chinese people don't have much liking for Baloch because the BLA has been instrumental in inflicting so many attacks on China. In fact, it's basically the BLA destabilization that has really rendered Gwadar such an expensive proposition for the Chinese. So that's there. Now, when it comes to Iran, of course, the Chinese, I mean, unlike in Pakistan, where the Chinese have invested right there in that dense Baloch region, Gwadar is there. But when it comes to Iran, the Chinese are interested in gas and oil and those kind of things, and they have made their investments, but which is not particularly in the Sistan province region. Long story short, Chinese interest there is going to be economic, and China has become, one of the biggest players in the region, whether it is with, Taliban's engagement with China or Iran's engagement with China, etc. So China is a big player there. And I think one of the reasons why you always see that it sort of comes with this intensity, but yet it is not able to sort of cross that threshold, I think China has a role to play behind the scenes. So that's by and large about China, that it will try to, keep it contained. But having said that, if you look at the realities on the ground, Devdatta, you do see that the BLA have gone to the extent of saying that they will not let CPEX run, and they have also joined hands with several other separatists, for example the Sindhis. All such news keeps coming. So it is a contested region. I do not see a greater Balochistan getting formed because of all the reasons that I just told you. And from India's perspective, I think the first thing that we need to do is that we need to have a fuller picture of what are the contours of this problem in its totality before sort of really having or discussing about some sort of strategy. So I think we need to sort of get to understand this situation better with all its layers, and especially that of the shadow economy.
Absolutely, Swasti. And on that note, since we are on the China question, I will take Tanusu's question on China and, the shuffling in PLA's top military brass. And she wants to know that PLA's top generals were removed end of last month. What exactly is it that Xi Jinping is trying to achieve here? And is he getting China ready for war, or is there just unrest in the government?
Okay. First of all, I feel very happy when Tanusu asks a question. So Tanusu, you
Right.
should ask more questions,
Welcome
right?
back.
Yeah, and welcome back. And we actually often talk, and whenever we are compiling these questions, I always ask her, has Tanusu asked a question? So you should know, okay, that you are quite a favorite here. Now coming back to your question, okay. Now before I tell you about what is happening, of course, what is basically happening is that Xi Jinping is purging his top generals left, right, and center. He's purging them like there's no tomorrow. Okay, so that of course raises certain questions on what does he want to do. So is he trying to consolidate power? Of course, a genuine and I would say correct assessment. Is he trying to fight corruption? Yes, of course. This is not the first time he has purged. Now, this particular purge that you're seeing there is nothing new. I mean, ever since Xi Jinping has actually become the general secretary of the CCP, he's been doing purge. The first round of purges started in 2013. Then, of course, it was more about getting his favorite people in place, getting people that were loyal to him in place, that kind of a thing. The second purge, which was more military in nature, actually started around the military reforms in 2016. Okay, that was the time when he started to sort of consolidate his, control and also get that was more military in nature. Then closer to where we are. Before this, the military purges happened in 2023 and then 2025. So there is a pattern, right? I mean, this is not something which is happening out of the blue or it has never happened. So that's one part. The second part is that I was asking this question to, somebody very relevant, and you should be interested in knowing who that was. So the managing director of the Japan Bank of International Cooperation was recently in Delhi. So I asked him this question on, okay, what is your preparation? Because Japan is militarizing a lot, right? Under Sanae Takaichi, the new female prime minister. So he said that, and what do you think about the purges? I mean, do you think Xi Jinping is going to do the 2027 Taiwan Strait that everybody keeps talking about? And he pointed at something which made a lot of sense. And in fact, I myself am of the same opinion. So in fact, the two purges that have gained the maximum amount of attention are Zhang Yuxia's and Liu Zhenli's. Now, Zhang Yuxia was the Central Military Commission Vice President, and Liu Zhenli is the Chief of the Joint Staff, right? Now, these two have garnered the maximum attention, and the argument is that now that he has purged these topmost generals that are also that could have been extremely instrumental had he really been planning an invasion of Taiwan, now he cannot, because if he were to get somebody new, right now there is no one, but if he were to get somebody new in 2026, there is too little time until 2027 to really make that happen. So this is by and large an accepted opinion among a lot of, I would say, experts, including that from Japan, that an opinion that I would take very seriously if it is to do with Taiwan Straits. Let's say if the Taiwan invasion is to be done, it has to be done with close cooperation between Eastern Theater Command of the Chinese as well as Joint Staff Department. And both these generals are now purged. So it raises some very simple questions on, while he's consolidating, while he's fighting corruption, there was some corruption in terms of their rocket force and all that. I mean, it's well known. But this perhaps then there is a silver lining, which is that he may not be as prepared for launching an invasion in Taiwan because his guys are no longer there. And Devdatta, I mean, just to tell you the seriousness of the purge, and also these figures keep repeating in different news cycles also. So if you look at the Central Military Commission of China, it has about 7 members. Out of the 7, of course, one is Xi Jinping himself, and 6 of them were brought by him into the CMC in 2022, and as of 2026, 5 of them have been removed, including the 2 generals I talked about. So right now it's Xi Jinping that is remaining, that's himself, and there's one more general who's remaining. So let's see how long he can remain.
And Swasti, since we just discussed China and Pakistan before that, there is yet another question on Pakistan, and this is by Subhashish Das, who wants to know that is there a chance that the world can come together to denuclearize Pakistan, and can India then drive it?
The short answer is no. Why am I saying and why am I giving you such a direct answer is that let's try to compare Pakistan and North Korea. Pakistan is, of course, a headache for us, but Pakistan is not the same way for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world continues to have its relationship with Pakistan. It is a $500 billion economy, even though it is having so many problems and, it is surviving from one tranche to another. I mean, the IMF tranche. Compared that to North Korea, which is about $25-30 billion economy. That's one part. Second, Pakistan is much more embedded in the global, I wouldn't say the economic chains as of now, because economy is not really absolutely, they have nothing in their economy to be proud of as of now. It's a completely army controlled country, and they export basically terrorism mostly. But let me just make it more, so this is on a lighter note, but let me make it more serious and tell you how they are embedded more in the defense industry synergies of different countries. I have so many times tried to explain how Pakistan has, ever since United States sort of withdrew its aid about a decade and a half ago, especially after the 2001 9/11 attacks. Okay, what you see is that sort of China coming in that space, but it's not just China's emergence in Pakistan's space. It is during that period that Pakistan has emerged as a revolving door of human intelligence, of miltech leakage between China, between Turkey, between Middle East and North Africa, and so on. And that's one part. So obviously, it is a very unfair, comparison, because I know where it is coming from. Because from India, we have a certain view of Pakistan, but that view is not shared by the rest of the world community. A, so diplomatically, it is very difficult, and two, because like I just mentioned, that the sheer embeddedness of Pakistan in terms of global defense energies in subsystems integration, I mean, you cannot even compare. Okay, so just to compare Pakistan and North Korea on this question of nuclear weapon, it's a very, very Indian perhaps desire. Okay, but it's and frankly, I mean, India has, I would say, quite stable relationship with North Korea. So again, it makes a comparison very difficult. So the short answer, that's why I told you that short answer is no.
Moving ahead, Swasti, there's a question by Ace No who says that there's a lot of partnership in the defense sector, like the Adani link up, and he wants to know that do you think that these private companies can do a better job in absorbing tech and building the military industrial complex than public sectors?
See, if you look at any country, and I'll try to give a shorter answer to this, because obviously this is something which is so close to my heart that I can go on talking about it for hours. So I'll try to give a short answer so that you get the big picture. Any country in the world, right? I mean, whether you look at any advanced military industrial complex, and when we say an advanced military industrial complex, obviously we mean a country like United States, a country like Israel, modern, obviously now China, Russia for a long time, France, I mean, you name it. So when you think of a country with an advanced military industrial complex, none of that has come up only because of the defense public sector units. Okay, they have come up because they have been able to, a, of course, invest in R&D that we don't do, and two, because they've been able to build more efficiency into the system by making it more competitive. And how will you make it competitive? The short answer to that is when you allow the competition to happen among different private players. Now, India, if you look at the defense acquisition procedure reforms and the guidelines from 2016 to 2020 to now 2025, you see that there is a push for more privatization, right? So there is a widespread recognition of the fact that in order to make the system more open, more competitive, more cost effective, you have to bring in the private sector. And you do see that there is a certain requirement that all these projects have to have a private sector component, etc. What we have done really remarkably differently in 2025 and 2026 is that in 2025 we opened our 5th generation fighter jet program to the private player, which was unprecedented, obviously, because here we are talking about choto saman, and now, I mean, tanks or something, but something as, I mean, critical as a fighter jet has always been steered by the DPSUs, and here I mean the HAL. Now, not only did we open it up in 2025 to private players, but in 2026, just 2 days ago, actually HAL got eliminated. Okay, so there were 8 players that had signed up, and only 3 remain. So the others that were eliminated, HAL was one of them, and there were certain criteria. My latest worldview is with Ajay on this, so I really recommend you watch it. It will give you a very good understanding of what is the internal story and what are the other details. But coming and circling back to the point that I was trying to drive home, basically India has obviously realized that time is a vector here, and obviously money is also a vector here, and the security situation along our borders isn't very stable. You will have a China, with whom we have an exponential difference in terms of our capabilities, and we have a Pakistan where we enjoy a linear edge. Having said that, we know that the problem is not Pakistan. The problem is Pakistan, which is backed by China. So in the scenario that we have, it definitely makes more sense for us to sort of go for more cost-effective solutions, more time-effective solutions, and basically building a system which is more competitive. And frankly, it cannot be done without the involvement of private players, to the extent that now we have our 5th generation fighter jet program, which is going to be steered by 3 players. I mean, either of the 3 players. So it has to be either Bharat Forge or Tata's or L&T. So we'll come to know who that is. So this is something which is a sea change, because we will have 2 synergies where the Tejas program is going to be steered by HAL, which has been so notorious for being delayed. Okay, and on the other hand, we will have an AMCA program which is going to be steered by the private sector. So we will also have a comparison to do. Just my last caveat is that while the involvement of the private sector is obviously welcome and is obviously a clear push that the government is trying to do, what we have to be sort of careful of is that most of these big contracts or most of the lucrative contracts going only to certain, industries, or only to, let's say, certain favorite, players, is also a problem, because that will also come in the way of actually building it transparent and building it really competitive. But let's remember, this is a work in progress. I mean, we are talking about a country that for decades was sort of, under this clutch of the DPSUs. Then it started to, weaken, and it will take some time to build it truly competitive. I think the government is very clear on that, and we should be welcoming it. Just with that caveat that it should not be, the benefits should not go only to the big players, because then the small players would not be able to survive, and this is again going to be bad news. Because if you carefully see all the emerging defense ecosystems which are doing very well, Turkey being a very, very good example, you really see how the smaller players have been able to create these niche capabilities. So we have to sort of come up with certain ways to also protect their interests.
With that, Swasti, we move to the Middle East, and there's a question by Sunil who wants to know basically that what is happening with Saudi Arabia. Like, we know that a lot of things have been happening simultaneously. They don't have leverage on oil pricing, they are going back on the Abraham Accords, they're getting closer to Pakistan. In that context, he wants to generally know that what is actually happening with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and how is this going to impact India then?
A relevant question, and I think a good question. Again, a region that we basically only multi-align, so we don't really get into the nitty-gritty of what is happening and what is the latest fight in town, etc. See, Middle East has been put together by a very fragile equilibrium, right? Middle East is a region where there are deep-rooted conflicts like the Israel question, the Gaza question, Iran, Houthis, enmity between the Shias and the Sunnis. Then to add to that, a lot of proxy wars, fragmented countries like Syria, okay, lot of foreign involvement, of course, because for a long time they were that's where the oil came from, okay, so because they were home to petrodollar, okay, and because of that, America had a very huge influence, which started to wane later as America found its own oil reserves, etc. So what I'm trying to tell you is that when because you refer to the Abraham Accords, so let me just begin from the Abraham Accords. It's a very interesting thing, an interesting point. Abraham Accords are basically scintillating success of Trump's first term, where he tried to do a normalization of ties between Israel and UAE on the one hand, and Israel and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. Now, of course, UAE is a much smarter, much resilient partner, because UAE operates like that. I mean, the biggest Hindu temple that we have in the Gulf is in the UAE. The biggest Gurudwara is in the UAE. UAE has always, the Emiratis have always, and especially under Mohammed bin Zayed, right? MBZ is a very, very seasoned, very mature player, okay? He knows that he has to aim for the moon. So he is very flexible. So while they understand that, normalizing ties with Israel would also unlock a lot of, economic potential, a lot of, trade, a lot of defense energies. So that was easier. But with Saudi Arabia, it became although it had started, but Saudi Arabia was obviously more hesitant for the simple reason that Saudi Arabia also has the Mecca and Medinas, okay? And they are, I mean, for them to normalize ties with the Jewish state is not so simple as it is for the Emiratis. In 2020, when the Abraham Accords were sort of, when they came up, there was certainly a new wave of normalization. In fact, India's sort of, outreach to to that region really benefited from the Abraham Accords. And if you remember, whether it is the I2U2, the India, Israel, UAE, and USA, that strategic quadrilateral, or the IMEC corridor itself, it was built on that normalization, right? And India, from India's perspective, so if Iran is on the other side, so we already had an INSTC with Iran, we had investments in Chabahar, and with the other side of the Muslim world, we had the IMEC. And if you remember, and thanks to this normalization, we already co-opted our growing ties with Israel, because Haifa was a major sort of, point within IMEC. Now, all of that went flying out of the window because of Hamas's attacks, and things have changed. Now, quickly, I don't want to tell you the history too much, but it is important to give you a context. What has happened and what is bothering Saudi Arabia right now? A couple of things. See, you mentioned first, they have not been able to earn a lot of money because of low oil prices, okay? And they're also part of this grouping called the OPEC and the OPEC Plus, right? Now, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, we did see that, some years ago, when Saudi Arabia wanted to have a certain view on production cuts, right? Emiratis went against it. So basically, it means to say that they are not really calling the shots alone. Then what started to happen is that they have something called a Vision 2030. And Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, right, they have been spending a lot of money on that. So they are a little short on cash right now. Couple of things have happened. Unprecedented rise in the power, and not just power, also, like this aggressive power of Israel, because the normalization went out of the window. So Israel, the manner in which, Israel have been striking not just Iran, but also the Houthis, even as we are speaking, there are strikes going on Lebanon, So this was something which Saudis are very, very uncomfortable with. Second, the unprecedented rise of Turkey because of Assad's fall in Syria. And I mean, so many times I've showed you the map, you can see the map again. Syria, north of Syria is under Turkish control, south of Syria is under, Israeli control, and, the middle Syria is where Al-Shara is running from pillar to post. And I think he's done a decent enough job because he had a very complicated country. But coming back, what I'm saying is that unprecedented rise of Israel on the one hand and unprecedented rise of Turkey on the other hand has actually an unprecedented decline in the power of Iran. Right? And remember, after Donald Trump came, what happened was that, if you remember, Israel went to the extent of targeting Hamas officials that were living in Qatar. So it struck Qatar, and US had bases in Qatar, and US knew. And that is why Donald Trump made Bibi Netanyahu say sorry, if you remember, to Qataris. But because of all this put together, this is a khichdi, but yes, because of all this put together, Saudi Arabia really cannot bank upon US as a major security provider, even though US is very much, I would say, calling the shots in the region, as of now, especially with respect to what is happening to Iran, etc. And one of the fallouts of that particular, power disturbance was the Saudis doing defense pact with Pakistan. And quickly, just to make matters worse and more complicated, we saw, and on 30th December, we saw that the Saudis went to the extent of targeting, basically striking ships, Emirati ships, which were allegedly carrying weapons. And this was in the port of Mukalla in Yemen. And ever since, it's been a very, very, I would say, downhill story, and there is a lot of tension. Now, quickly, the beneficiary of that tension has been largely, I would say, Israel to some extent, because Israel was very quick to sort of find a convergence with the Emiratis. They said, we are already normal. We are also together in IMEC, and, Saudi Arabia is sort of leaning more towards Pakistan, and etc. And second was Turkey, because Turkey, there was so much of this sort of bifurcation into the GCC, geopolitics and geoeconomics, where you saw that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan are coming closer. Also, Qatar and so on. And on the other side, you had UAE and Israel. And if you remember, MBZ had come to India, because you've asked about what India should do. So MBZ had come to India quickly. But, I'd always argued that India converges more with the Emiratis and with Israel because of the trade and the weapons and everything. And also with Emiratis, we have a very I would say multi-vector, engagement, which is cutting across a lot of sectors. But despite that, India would not like to take clear sides. But your question is let on India. But your question is less on India. So let me just come back and circle to where things are. Now, right now, Middle East is in a very precarious situation. Okay. If we are thinking that the Saudi Emirati rift is going to go away anytime soon, that is not going to happen. Secondly, Turkey, although it is converging more on the side of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, remember that Turkey has a very good defense industry relationship with the Emiratis already. Okay, last year, in fact, Forbes really published this wonderful article, and I'm putting it in the description box so you can read it, where they said that Turkey will not align with Saudi Arabia because there is a $50 billion investment which is stopping Turkey from doing it. And that $50 billion investment was what Turkey made with the Emiratis. So, long story short, Turkey has these two streams of revenues. Turkey would like to keep both these revenues, streams running. Turkey is known to compartmentalize its foreign policy, but after this, if you look at it from, if you zoom out a little bit, there is without a doubt a situation, an unprecedented situation where both Saudi Arabia and UAE were together against the Muslim Brotherhood, were together in IMEC, and all that. And suddenly you see a situation where there is a rupture, and this rupture is going to grow because so far we have only seen Yemen and the tensions in Yemen and Somaliland and so far. Now, the real test will come in Sudan because we have to see what is going on there. And then, as you know, all these, countries, these big countries are also supporting opposing factions, and not just these countries, but also in Libya and so on. So it's a very dirty game. So we will come to know, but as of now, the situation is precarious. Saudi Arabia is, although the biggest country and the richest country, but despite that, it is not as agile, and it has not really embedded itself into the financial networks, into the proxy network, into the investment networks as much as the Emiratis did. And to that, you have to sort of give it to the Emiratis that they've been smarter. Emiratis are also having a problem because Emiratis were piggybacking the Saudi legitimacy in the region with the Mecca and Medina and all that, the religious legitimacy. So it is complex. And my only last 2 cents would be that India will continue multi-aligning, although India tilts much more towards Israel and the Emiratis. But we will not see a clear taking sides or some meaty defense cooperation agreement, which is comparable to what the Saudis have done with Pakistan. We won't see that.
And Swasti, with that, we come to one last question by Amit History, who wants you to shed some light on the Indo-German partnership and how it is going to shape up the future, and then on India's trade deals with EU and how it can be, how it can impact the strategic calculus of our neighbors, especially China and Pakistan.
Now, Amit, what I can say is that for the FTA with the EU,
We have already.
I suggest you
discussed
go
it.
back to the previous GPS
Yeah.
because we have taken it absolutely in every length and detail possible. I'll focus on the German bit, and I'll just tell you something very interesting because, of course, it's been a very long discussion today, even though we try to keep it short. Okay, I'll tell you where the proof of the pudding is. There is without a doubt, the India-Germany relations are growing, trade is growing, investment is growing. Okay, bilateral trade is obviously in 2025, it crossed $50 billion. So if you look at the joint statements, you will see all those figures. The problem is that with Donald Trump in picture, right? Before Donald Trump, when things were clear that India is going to be the de-risking destination about the investments that are not going to China, because the whole world, especially Europeans and the Western world, and as long as they were together, they were finding ways to de-risk from China, and India fitted in very perfectly in that equation because if the investments are not going to China, where will they go? Obviously, they would go to Vietnam and these countries, but the large part of them were supposed to come to India because it's also strategic. India really was the counterweight in Indo-Pacific. Now, with Donald Trump, that logic is over. And if you carefully see what Donald Trump is doing with the Europeans, is that Donald Trump is really pushing them into the arms of China because Donald Trump has made their relationship so bad with the US and so uncertain that these firms that were until now really sort of wishing to de-risk. Okay, because they were aware of their dependencies on China, right? They wanted to de-risk, cannot really afford to take that chance. And why it is impacting India is that, until about 2 years ago, or until about, I would say 2 years ago, before Donald Trump came, whenever we had a conversation with the Germans saying that while you are investing in India, but you are also simultaneously investing a lot in China, you know what they would say? They would say, okay, two things. One is that what the investment that you see from the German side going to China, or this is by and large a European phenomena, but because Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, so we are talking about Germany. So this phenomena that you see is actually relegated to the corporates, right? If you look at the SMEs, which form the backbone of the German economy, they have already started to de-risk a lot from China. Now, why the corporates and the big businesses don't do it? Because it is very expensive for them. So they can only do it very slowly. But they would assure us and say that, but you know what, it is in Germany's interest to build resilience, and we are very aware of our manufacturing, dependencies on China. So in due course we are going to do it, and this is what the larger west has to do it. Come Donald Trump, and just February 2026 figures, or January, end January, late January 2026, a report came which showed that Donald Trump's unpredictability is pushing all of that back to China, even though they understand the risks associated with it. But January figures tell us that the corporate investment in by Germany in China has already reached a 4-year high. So all this unpredictability with United States obviously is first, bringing India and EU together. But when it comes to really getting investments from Germany, investments from other European players, it is going to be very tough, because while they see less incentive in de-risking immediately because that's very risky, India in the short term also is not a very attractive place for investments, because remember, the first generation of China plus one de-risking, etc., it didn't benefit India directly. It went to Vietnam, it went to Singapore. So we need time to improve our investment ecosystem. I'm sure you must be hearing these things of India spooks investors away. Okay, so India has to really do that internal work. Otherwise, we will not be able to. Our trade will grow. Our people, we will have more people to people ties. Our trade will definitely grow. Some investment will also come, but the investment has to come in proportion to the GDP, right? That is when we are going to be helping by becoming, a manufacturing hub. Right now, we aren't, So right now, according to the Make in India and PLI, schemes, our manufacturing was supposed to reach at least 25% of our GDP when it was launched. So in 10 years, but in 10 years, it's fallen below 14%. And this is a figure I keep repeating a lot, because unless we work on those figures, what we are doing is that the more we are exporting to the West, the more we are importing from China, right? And then I gave you the figures of the German firms. So Donald Trump has made a de-risking from China very, very costly. And a lot of big firms that have a lot of pressure right now to handle would delay it further. And that is going to have a direct implication for us, because ideally we are the ones where it should come. It is in their interest as well.
On that note, we come to an end of this episode and we look forward to our questions for next week. Stay tuned for a fresh episode. Thank you.